COVID is a global phenomena, you're seeing it most in cities. The same way, climate is a global phenomena, and we are experiencing what a future world would be in the context of what is happening in cities, in terms of the warming we are seeing, in terms of the exposure we are creating for people, in terms of the emissions that are coming from the city. And at the same time, it provides us with a beautiful collaboratory to test the solutions now to get ready for a future world. So cities become critical, and we are learning a lot in terms of how we can start looking at those things. The second thing that I really appreciated was the call to inspire solutions and how we can create solutions. We have been doing, and this sort of reflects on the energy Shamila's comments about climate literacy. And we had been doing projects across in Asia and Africa and United States, Midwest, and so forth, where we have been looking at this whole context of how do you improve climate literacy, going right from middle school to high school to university, citizens, and beyond. And one of the enduring conclusions that emerges is that climate, like politics, is very local. We need to have a local context, we need to have a local solution, and we need to have actions which we think we can initiate and create rather than being at the receiving end of something that has happened globally. So while this is a global phenomena, and I really appreciate what is being discussed in terms of how do we create this whole framework of tools which sort of democratizes this process of creating knowledge, information out of data and tools. So if we take a step back, I look at it from the context of a scientist. Many a times we are, of course, quoted as being the source of what might be the source of misinformation or disinformation. But at the same time, the scientific community, you must be made aware, is also at the receiving end of the problems that occur because of the misinformation and how it takes our resources away. Uh, and let me say first of all that why is this so easy in the world of climate change to have disinformation? First and foremost, climate is very difficult. We don't experience climate, we experience weather. Very few of us over a period of our lifetime, we are going to be experiencing climate change when we look at things. Even when we start looking at the context of how climate and weather is being reported, we have seen so many times reports about persons talking about a intense snowstorm and equating that where is global warming. So we see this dichotomy of understanding about weather versus climate. Even within that, you can start seeing climate is classified between climate change versus climate variability. We have this aspect coming in. Within that, we have players which are at a natural scale, like emissions coming from volcanoes and natural forest fires and clouds and so forth, and the El Nino, which can cause natural changes in the climate. And then we have the human induced changes, which can cause long term specific changes going into the future, which could be, say, from urbanization, land use change, our own pollution, as well as our emissions that we all know are critically shown without any doubt to be causing these climatic changes. Now, the problem is when you're presenting a scenario about a climate, it is very easy to see that all of these factors are acting in tandem. It is not like it is only a natural effect or only an artificial feature that is acting together. All of these features are acting together. And so it is very easy for anyone to slice a part of an event and present it in the manner that makes most convenient sense to their perspective. Secondly, it may not be that there is a vile intent in presenting such information. The person who is presenting it might genuinely believe that this is the scientific way that they should be presenting this. And this is the really important hypothesis that ought to be conveyed to the community, which is at the backbone of science. So we have two people or two groups, what one would say, who genuinely believe that they are doing good science, who genuinely believe that they are advancing something which is for the good of the society many a times. And within that, we create a potential for an outsider to look at possibilities which could create a potential for confusion and disinformation. What is also, of course, relevant here is that there are several entities which would have an agenda-driven framework here that they're trying to perpetuate embedded within the wiles of presenting new knowledge. And that is where we have our biggest challenge going ahead. That yes, at one level, we want to support this novel ideas of hypothesis-driven science. We want to respect and support freedom of speech. And at the same time, we need to find a way that this embedded disinformation that starts getting perpetuated, either intently or without knowledge, how do we separate that out? So there are several things that start emerging that this is a, as we call it, a wicked problem. We have it going everywhere. We can't rely only on the source. And hence, as I mentioned, we need to democratize this whole process of how can people create institutions and countries create their own mechanisms by which this can be filtered out. So there are a few things that need to be done, and I'll quickly summarize that I've been thinking and going on. So first and foremost, data, as we all know, is a new currency. Uh, as we are getting into a data-driven world, data is going to be creating lots of commercial values. In a climate and weather scenario, data has always been regarded as an open entity which ought to be freely shared. You might be war at a country, but you'll be sharing weather information because that's how the weather and climate community has worked. We need to find a way to ensure climatic information and data is freely and openly available. That, even though it looks like an obvious, has to be one of the critical mandate of this. Keep it accessible, keep it open. Second, we need to have tools. These tools can be at one end highly technology driven based on artificial intelligence, which is looking at patterns and so forth. But it also needs to have portals. These portals that we discussed would have framework of where we are looking at examples, where you're looking for access to data, but more importantly, resources, that you cannot control the source of information, but you can control the manner in which you can analyze and create your own information. So you need to have this knowledge base. So that brings a very important concept of capacity building. And the capacity building is where I think we have the most enduring and sustained information that can be created for the community that goes across the generations. So we talked about climate change education. We have done these projects across. Working with UNESCO, there has been a very, very successful example I have seen, particularly in the Southeast Asia region, of a monsoon school that they had been doing and conducting and supporting for urban flooding, which really took information from highly heterogeneous sources, brought out the experiential aspect, made people start thinking like policymakers, like engineers, young PhDs, fresh PhDs, young researchers, and really starting to see the complexity and the non-linearity of these decisions outside the classroom teaching. This exposure is very important, that you have a highly complex and non-linear world. Third is we have been doing things for peer review exercise. We heard this, peer review is at backbone of our climate change research. But how often do we actually teach peer review? So we had been actually developing modules and courses to teach peer review, and we need to take this into a common language across the communities to really understand the value and the principles behind it. Embedded somewhere, we need to be recognizing the freedom of speech aspect and making sure that when we are filtering this thing out, we do not impede on that basic human right of freedom of speech. Just because we may not like something, we cannot not listen to it. We need to ensure that. At the UN level, I think projects are really required that hold countries accountable to some extent not to be creating this kind of disinformation or supporting projects which could be creating disinformation. But at the same time, creating pilots that can be scaled, reproduced, and used by member nations as seeing as examples in a manner in which this whole premise that we take information, data, and knowledge from a useful to usable framework that can be taken to communities is really possible. And that goes to the context, as I mentioned, like doing uh, communication skills. It could be in the context of the storytelling aspect I heard from Ricardo. It could be in the climate literacy aspect. It could be data-driven tools for specific projects. I think the bottom line, going back to COVID, we have well seen that we are living in goodness. There are people around us who are really trying to do good things. If you really generally look around, if you go with this context that communities and people are trying to do good, we need to present them with more options of how to do good. Else, they are going to be doing their old fashioned ways that they always thought this is the only way of doing it and not be able to come up with novel ideas for this novel problem. I think creating this multifaceted do good options, creating these tools that we can start utilizing in terms of the knowledge sharing and integration of ideas, we can really come up with the ways that creates disinformation as a way that can be filtered out. We cannot ever take away disinformation from the society. But what we can do is create tools that we can at least find ways to filter some of it out. And I firmly believe even a small change into this dialogue can cascade in creating more and more such powerful techniques that can happen going ahead into the future.